The Firekeeper's Bride, Part 6, The Trial of Fire. The hall was silent. The king had agreed to the trial. Seraphina had bought them time but not safety. Now, Kael had to win. She felt his heat beside her, his body rigid, his golden eyes locked on the king. King Edric leaned forward, resting his elbows on the grand table. The trial of fire has not been invoked in over a century. Do you truly wish to test fate, Firekeeper? Kael's voice was steady. Fate has already tested me. The king's lips curled. Then so be it. He gestured to his advisors, who stepped forward with an ancient scroll, its edges burned and blackened with age. The trial consists of 3 tests, the king announced: strength, wisdom, endurance. Each one must be passed. His dark eyes gleamed as he added, "Or you both belong to me." The first challenge was set at sunrise in the courtyard of the Obsidian Keep. Word had spread quickly. Soldiers and nobles gathered along the stone walkways, murmuring among themselves. Seraphina stood near the edge, her heart hammering. Kael had been given a weapon of his choice. He chose no weapon at all. Seraphina clenched her hands. Why won't he fight with a blade? A voice behind her answered. Because he doesn't need one. She turned to see Lord Edric, the king's war general. He nodded toward the field. The Firekeeper is a legend for a reason. Seraphina swallowed. Across the courtyard, Kael stood alone. His opponent was a knight from the royal guard, twice his size, armored in steel. The knight lunged. Kael sidestepped easily, swift as shadow. His hands moved like fire itself, quick, unpredictable. The knight struck again. Kael caught the blade with his bare hands. The metal began to glow red-hot. The knight cried out, dropping the sword, his palm seared from the heat. The crowd gasped. Seraphina felt her pulse quicken. The king raised a hand. Enough. Kael stepped back unscathed. Victorious. The first test was over. The second challenge took place at dusk in the grand hall. The king sat on his throne of black iron, watching as his royal scholars placed 3 identical chalices on a velvet-draped table. In one of these cups, the king said smoothly, "There is poison." In another, "There is only water." And in the last, "There is wine." He gestured toward Kael. "Choose wisely." Seraphina's breath caught. This was a game of the mind, a trap. Kael stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The scholars stood silent, their hands folded. No movement, no clues, but Seraphina saw it. A flicker in the king's gaze, a small, almost imperceptible smirk. This was not a test of wisdom. It was a test of control. Kael reached for the first cup, then paused. His golden eyes flickered to the king's hands, and suddenly, he smirked. Without hesitation, Kael lifted the cup the king had been closest to, and drank. Gasps echoed through the room. Seraphina's stomach dropped, but Kael did not waver. Instead, he set the chalice down, exhaled slowly, and said, "The king would never allow poison near himself. That would be foolish." The king's lips pressed into a thin line. Kael had won. Again, at midnight, the last trial was set in the heart of the keep where the fire burned strongest. Kael stood alone in the sacred chamber, where a ring of flame blazed around him. "The test of endurance is simple," the king said. "Step through the fire and prove that you are more than a man." Seraphina clenched her fists. This wasn't a test. This was a punishment. Kael's own fire had never harmed him, but this fire was different. It was enchanted. It was meant to break him. Seraphina's heart pounded. Kael lifted his chin, unshaken, unafraid, and then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The flames roared, surrounding him. For a moment, all Seraphina could see was fire. Then Kael emerged, unburned, unbroken, and for the first time, the king looked afraid. Silence stretched through the hall. Then, the king rose. 3 tests, he said, his voice tight. 3 victories. He forced a smile. The Firekeeper remains ruler of the Obsidian Keep, and his bride remains at his side. The crowd cheered. But Seraphina wasn't looking at the king. She was looking at Kael. For the first time since she had arrived, he turned to her, truly turned to her. And in his golden eyes, she saw something new, something unspoken, something that made her heart race. This was no longer just an arranged marriage. This was a war they had won together, and something between them had changed forever. To be continued.